And good morning once again, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to AP Virtual History on College Board on YouTube. My name is Mr. Horton from Williamsville South High School, just outside of Buffalo, if you're just tuning in for the first time. Buffalo is experiencing snow this morning, and we're expecting it to be 60 degrees on Sunday. So that's our weather reality here. If at any time you have questions during the presentation, please tweet them at virtual APUSH. As you can see on the screen there, I'm also going to ask a couple questions during the presentation today that my partner in crime, Ms. Farr from just outside of Atlanta, she's going to be answering those questions for you. So that's kind of how we roll. So thank you again for tuning in this morning. So a quick warm-up question that we left off with yesterday was the question about what is America's role in the world today, and hopefully you had a little bit of time to think about that over the course of since yesterday. And so there's lots of answers to that. Is America still a military leader in the world? Is America still an industrial leader in the world? Is America still a moral leader in the world? Those are all kinds of questions that we're going to hopefully tackle today, because those are the questions that presidents of the period really after the Cold War ended had to figure out. What's the next step for the United States is really what they had to deal with. And so we're going to deal with that a little bit. So our overview is really America since Ronald Reagan. So we're going to pick up with the presidency of President George H.W. Bush and work our way through President Obama. We left off President Trump because traditionally the current president has not been on the exam. And the skill is going to be focusing on sourcing, especially political cartoons. I know I did some work with that a couple of sessions ago, but we're going to kind of revisit that, maybe add a little bit more detail there for you. And then tomorrow, Ms. Farr will really be wrapping up period 9. We begin our review segment of this the show, if you want to call it that, starting on Monday. So we'll start with period 1 on Monday. So some things that hopefully you already know. Earlier this week, we spent some time looking at the rise of conservatism, what conservative ideas were that really got their start in the 1970s. We spent some time with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who in many ways fulfills some of those conservative promises in the United States. And really, we're going to pick up after that. So I noticed yesterday on the Twitter, a lot of people were asking questions about contextualization. So my contextualization for today's presentation is the presidency of Ronald Reagan and the rise of conservatism. So in one way, contextualization is sort of the background, or where trying to help you understand where today's story fits in the overall story, the big picture or the frame of what we're doing. So the overriding question is, what are the challenges that have faced America since 1988? And hopefully at the end of the lesson, you have a much better grasp on looking at political cartoons. So some keys to understanding political cartoons, some things to think about as we go through these, and I'll try to remind you of this as we go and get into them a little bit. These are just five different things for you to think about when you look at a political cartoon. Symbolism is the first one. Obviously, symbols are used to stand in for other things there. And again, understanding the context of things will help you to understand what those symbols stand for in the political cartoon. Exaggeration, you'll see this in several of our examples where something is overly exaggerated, and there's a reason for that. The cartoonist is trying to draw your attention to that. Labeling, read the label, and the one that's not really listed here is read the caption too. Those are important. Sometimes they'll help you to understand just exactly what it is that the cartoonist is trying to make you understand. So, and they label things to make sure it's absolutely clear a lot of the time. Analogy, they'll make some comparisons between things. You'll see a really great example of that, I think, in just a second when we take a look at that. And then irony, and I mentioned the last time we looked at political cartoons, you have to be careful of taking things at face value in cartoons. A lot of times things are put in there to be ironic. So so let's try one. So here's a modern political cartoon. What are the symbols in this political cartoon? Do the labels make it clear? What's the analogy that's being made here? So we've got the timer started for you. So when we look at this cartoon, you see some healthcare workers, and they're lifting up what looks like a flag, and of course the flag is the label. So I think that helps to clarify exactly what it is that they're, who these folks are, if you didn't get it from the machinery that's there in the IV bag. And what's the analogy? They're making a connection here to an important symbol from American history, and hopefully you identify that. And if you haven't identified that, of course, they're talking about this very famous picture from Mount Suribachi, where the Marines who stormed that island in February of 1945, when they finally reached the summit of that of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, they raised the flag, and this very famous photograph was taken. So in the lower right-hand part of the screen, you see the actual photograph of the Marines doing that, and then in the upper left-hand corner, you see the Marine Corps statue, which celebrates that very important moment in that. So they're playing on this image in the cartoon. Which is what they want you to think about. So these are heroic people that have done something. In this case, in February of 1945, they've overcome these, terrible odds. And when you look at the cartoon, that's kind of the analogy that this cartoonist is trying to make. That these are people that are heroic, and they're trying to win this battle against this outbreak of COVID-19 that we're all living with. So some guided practice, we're going to start with just some information here, just a little bit. So George H.W. Bush, who becomes president in 1989, he's elected in 1988. And so in domestic policy, a couple of things I think that are important about him. He makes a promise during the campaign, very famously saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Very conservative idea. We're not going to raise taxes. In fact, we're going to lower them. And he will come to regret saying that, as we'll see, because he eventually has to raise new taxes in order to try to cover the deficit, and that will get him in some hot water with people that he had promised not to do that. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or what's commonly referred to as the ADA, that is a law that that forced public buildings to be accessible to people that were handicapped, people in wheelchairs, for example. Immigration Reform Act, we're going to talk more about immigration a little bit later in the presentation. And the S&L crisis, which I actually referred to a couple days ago, the savings and loan industry, which there's a crash of that industry during his presidency. So a couple of good things here, and a couple that, again, he would be criticized for. In foreign policy, and I know Ms. Farr talked a little bit about the Persian Gulf War yesterday, the first Persian Gulf War, as we now have to call it, because there's going to be another one, which we'll see. But the Persian Gulf War, which happened starting in 1990, the actual war itself begins in January of 1991. I remember because I was working at a local department store at the time and had the radio going, and I remember the DJ coming on and telling us that the show had started, was the way that he put it. And as Ms. Farr mentioned yesterday, this was one of those wars that you could tune in every single night to CNN and see exactly what was going on. And it's probably the widest covered war in history at that time. So, but it's a war that goes very, very well. It goes very quickly. Not a whole lot of casualties for the United States, and that makes George H.W. Bush very, very popular in the U.S. And he also is president during the transition from the end of the Cold War. Communism falls while he's president, as Ms. Farr talked about yesterday. The Soviet Union itself collapses in 1991, and that really is the end of the Cold War. And the questions that he begins to deal with are the questions that we'll see with really the rest of the presidents here is, well, now what? I mean, during the Cold War, it was pretty clear the United States was the leader of the free world, and we were going to contain communism, and we had to resist the influence of the Soviets. But once the Soviets are gone, the question becomes, well, what's next for the United States? Manuel Noriega is arrested. He is the leader of Panama. At the end of the decade, very similar to interventions in Latin America that President Reagan had engaged in during that time period. So this is a map that shows the outcome of that war. The blue area here was the buildup of Allied troops in the period of the fall of 1990. And eventually the air war began in January, the ground war, sending troops actually into Iraq to cut off the Iraqi supply lines in Kuwait. Happens in February of that year, and within 4 or 5 days, the ground war is basically over. So as I mentioned before, very, very successful. Of course, one of the issues here you'll notice all over the map is major oil fields. And you can see these little oil derricks here that are all over the place. And of course, this is an important part of the story. Kuwait controlled the valuable resource of oil, and we sort of hinted at the importance of that a couple of days ago. So let's try a political cartoon. Again, think about the symbols, the labels, the analogy that's being made here. So hopefully you're recognizing the symbol there of these soldiers lifting up a flag, which we started the lesson today with, taking a look at that. But in this case, the cartoonist is giving us a different message, and they're lifting up a sign that says ExxonMobil, which of course is an oil company. And so the Iraq Memorial here is soldiers lifting up the story of ExxonMobil. And so this cartoonist is criticizing a war that he apparently views as a war about oil, and that is questioning really the purpose of that war, as many people did in the 1990s. Was this a war for just for oil? And we'll see that again in a little bit later. End of the Cold War, again, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, so don't have to spend a lot of time here on that. But I have another political cartoon for you to think about. You can take a look at this. We'll get the timer started. Again, think of the symbols, what's labeled here. Is anything exaggerated here? Okay, so in the cartoon, of course, we see the Berlin Wall with a huge hole smashed in it. And of course, the thing that has smashed the hole in it is a footprint with Ronald Reagan's name on it. So we see a couple of things. I think the Reagan label is a really an important one there. So what is this cartoonist trying to tell us? And of course, the implication is that Reagan is the reason why the wall came down. Reagan gave a very famous speech at the Berlin Wall when he was president, famously challenging Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, to tear down this wall. And this cartoonist is suggesting, of course, that Reagan is the reason why eventually the Berlin Wall, which was the symbol of the Cold War, did in fact collapse. So again, some good exaggeration here, certainly some good labeling in this one. Moving on to President Clinton. So Clinton, it kind of broke this up into two sides. So there's a couple of mistakes that he makes early on. You could argue politically that he makes a couple of mistakes here. I'll explain that. So the don't ask, don't tell policy. The reason I would call that a mistake is because Clinton didn't go far enough to make advocates of gay rights happy, but he went too far to make people that were opposed to gay rights happy. So he ended up creating a policy that it seemed like nobody was really happy with. Healthcare reform, he attempts to create a healthcare system in the United States, and we'll come back to that issue a little bit later on. And he has a reversal in the 1994 midterms, and we'll talk about the contract with America in more detail in just a few moments. So a couple mistakes. I think you could argue he sort of stumbles coming out of the gate early on in his presidency, but he also has some successes early on. The Family Medical Leave Act, which protects people's jobs in situations where they have to take lengthy periods of time off for medical leave, for example. The Brady Bill, which created a national background check and a waiting period to purchase handguns. And you see in the image in the middle of the slide here is Clinton signing that law. And next to him is James Brady, who was a secretary to President Reagan. And he was actually wounded in the assassination attempt that happened against Reagan early on. So, you know, Clinton liked the symbolism of these kinds of things. So the bill is named for him. And of course, he was present when it was officially being signed there. Trying to balancing the budget by raising taxes on the wealthy and cutting spending. So raising taxes on the wealthy, of course, would be something that conservatives would be opposed to. Cutting spending, though, would be something that liberals would be opposed to. So Clinton tries to find sort of a middle ground between those two positions. And Clinton was president when the dot-com boom hit. And what that means is the internet became commercially available to people in the mid 1990s, and the economy really took off and did very well during the 1990s. And as always happens, Hoover is a really good example from the past. Whoever's president, if the economy goes well, they typically get the credit, and if it doesn't, they take the blame. So this is no different than that. So this is the internet really taking off in the mid 1990s. So NAFTA, I don't want to talk a whole lot about that because I know it was covered yesterday, but this is that free trade idea that America, Canada, and Mexico would basically open their borders. And Clinton advocates for this to be passed. And again, this is not necessarily a liberal program. It's more of something that liberals were against, especially labor union groups. We'll get into that in just a second here. But so as I mentioned a couple of sessions ago, you know, the presidents here aren't always 100% liberal or 100% conservative. So let's try a political cartoon again. So what is the point of view of this cartoon? Kind of look at labels here, symbols. Okay, so hopefully you notice some symbols in the image here, or the labels. It's obvious he's standing in front of a factory, but hopefully you notice that the door, the gate is locked behind him. It's chained closed. And there's a closed sign, of course, on that gate as well. And Labor Day, which is the day that typically is used to celebrate the American worker, you see that Labor Day is not being held in America this year, according to the sign, but it's going to be held in Mexico. And this is a criticism of NAFTA, that jobs might potentially be transported to countries outside the United States because labor costs typically were cheaper there. And so here's an American worker that's obviously unemployed, has lost his job as a result of this. So this cartoonist is criticizing of course, NAFTA. So that would be the context of this, or historical situation, understanding exactly what the reference is in this cartoon. All right, the contract with America. This is Newt Gingrich, who is the leader of a group of Republicans in the House of Representatives that ran on a platform that you'll see here on the screen. And they end up winning a victory by sweeping many conservatives into office in 1994. And you'll notice some things that are very similar to the conservative beliefs we talked about before. Things like increasing defense spending, being opposed to abortion, being tough on crime. I mean, these are all things, welfare reform, cutting back on social program spending. So these are not anything really new. They really date back into the 1970s and 1980s. And so Newt Gingrich, of course, becomes the leader of the Republicans in the House of Representatives. He becomes the Speaker of the House. And we're going to take a look at a cartoon about the contract with America here, this sort of resurgence of conservative thinking here. Again, think of symbols and labels. Is there something ironic here? Okay, so, and the title of this is Betsy Ross Gingrich, which I think is important to understanding what's happening here. And hopefully you recognize the symbolism of Betsy Ross, who is famously known for knitting or sewing the flag way back in the Revolutionary era. And so you have Newt Gingrich, who is, of course, the leader of the Republicans, as I just was talking about, sewing or knitting a flag that says "Contract with America" on it. But the threads for that, of course, have come from the social safety net for the poor. Things like welfare, for example, might be something that this cartoonist might be referring to here. So what's the point of view of the Contract with America? They're clearly criticizing this policy as being hurtful to the social safety net, is what the message that the cartoonist is trying to share with us here. America becomes more of a peacekeeper in the world, and this is part of the story. Certainly defending Kuwait during President George H.W. Bush's presidency is part of that. President Clinton authorized bombing in Serbia as a reaction against ethnic cleansing, which was happening there. And ethnic cleansing is a really euphemistic way of talking about genocide. Different groups of people were being herded into camps and ultimately killed as a result of their ethnic background. So let's take a look at this cartoon and think about, again, symbolism and labels and irony, perhaps. So in this cartoon, you see some gravestones, and the gravestones, of course, are labeled with all kinds of examples of genocide that's occurred in the past. Of course, the largest one being the Holocaust, right in the middle there. And next to the Holocaust in this cartoon is Bosnia. And you see it's labeled there 1992 to 1995. And so what's the point of view of this cartoon? This cartoonist is suggesting that we always say never again, and yet it happens again and again and again. We seem to forget those lessons of history, is kind of the point of view that this cartoonist is suggesting, that we keep saying never again, but we maybe need to follow through on that a little bit better. All right. Now, Bill Clinton was impeached as well. He was impeached on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice, but he was acquitted by the Senate in February of 1999. There weren't enough votes to convict him of that. And it was only the second impeachment of a president in American history, at least at that point. Of course, President Trump has been impeached, as you've all lived through. And a little question for Twitter here. So if you see if you know this answer, who is the third president, the other president that was impeached in American history? Not Clinton, not Trump, but the other president that was impeached in American history. So if you know the answer to that, go ahead. Feel free to go ahead and tweet that to @virtualapush. Try to do a little interactive things here. Clinton was impeached for encouraging people to lie under the oath of office, and you see at the bottom here some of the central figures of that impeachment. The woman on the left, lower left, is Linda Tripp, and she actually passed away yesterday morning. I just read in the news this morning. So, but there's all kinds of elements of the scandal, which we don't need to get into a lot of the depth of that. But so let's think about what the point of view of this cartoon is. Get the timer started here for you. All right, some great symbolism in this one, some good exaggeration too. Of course, you have Nixon on the left there, and he's got the long pointy nose, which we saw a couple days ago if you came in and were watching. And Hoxetti was the first person to answer correctly of my question just a moment ago. I'll get to the answer to that in a second, give you a little bit more time on the other president that was impeached. So you see Nixon here, and he's saying just a word from experience. And then you see Bill Clinton, who typically the big bulbous nose is pretty typical of cartoons of him. It's the cover up that will get you. And of course, we have President Trump saying, what cover up? So point of view here is trying to connect these three presidents. And a lot of you answered that Nixon was the other president that was impeached, and that actually is not true. The impeachment proceedings were beginning when Nixon resigned from the presidency, so he's not the answer to my question, although he's included here because he most likely would have been impeached. In fact, Barry Goldwater, who was a senator at the time, went to the White House and told Nixon that he could count on Congress voting to actually go ahead and impeach him, but it never got that far. So he's not the answer. So the connection here they're trying to make, of course, is that, or the point that's trying to be made here is it's not really the original crime that seems to be the thing that gets these guys in trouble. It's the attempt to cover it up afterwards, and they're sort of hinting this at Donald Trump, of course, and of course, this is critical of the president, as many cartoons typically are critical, and we'll see that again in a couple of other examples. So congratulations to those of you that got the answer right to my question. And the correct answer is Andrew Johnson, way back in 1868, after the American Civil War during the Reconstruction period. He was the first ever president to be impeached a long, long time ago. So within my lifetime, I've seen 2 impeachments of presidents. So it doesn't happen all that much. So moving on to George W. Bush. So George W. Bush, one of the issues with him becoming president was the election of 2000, which was a very, very controversial election that ultimately resulted in a Supreme Court decision to stop recounting ballots. So I'll show you one of the reasons why this became sort of controversial. This was called the Butterfly Ballot, which they used in Florida. So if you look at the image here, okay, we have the Republican and the Democrat, right, reading down the left-hand side here, and libertarian, et cetera. And on the right-hand side, we have reform and socialist and constitution, et cetera. So many voters, it appears, went into the voting booth and looked at this and said, okay, let's see, I want to vote for Al Gore. So that's 2 down, 1, 2. So everybody take a look at the screen here. If you actually did that and you voted for the second bullet down, here's my first vote or first place to vote, my second one, I'm not actually voting for Al Gore. I'm actually voting for Pat Buchanan. So the way the ballot was constructed seemed to be awfully confusing to people. And this became one of the contentions in that election was, how do we figure out, if people actually incorrectly voted or voted inadvertently for the wrong person. And this is one of many pieces of the controversy. These are called chads, these little pieces of paper. And some people suggested that if the little piece of paper was still on, that maybe we shouldn't count that vote. Got a little bit crazy. So here's a little cartoon about the 2000 election. See if you can figure out the point of view here. This one's a pretty good one. Of course, you see it's very easy to vote for President Bush in this cartoon, very straightforward line. And of course, if you wanted to vote for anybody else, it was pretty complicated. So if we go back to that ballot, that butterfly ballot, of course, this cartoon is criticizing that. If you wanted to vote for George W. Bush in 2000, pretty easy. It's the top one. You're going to make that vote every single time here. Now, the other, so President Bush, when he becomes president, these are some of his domestic policies, a tax cut, which that should sound familiar. Conservatives, of course, like tax cuts or promote tax cuts, and George W. Bush does the same thing here. There's a recession that hits in 2007, 2008, along with the failure of the housing market and bank failures. There's a movie that really tells the story well. I know a lot of economics teachers out there use it. It's called The Big Short. Tells the story of that. But the thing that I think George W. Bush most will be remembered for is this event.
September 11th, 2001. A day of grief. A day of courage. This is how that day unfolded.
My daughter called me. She said, a plane just flew into the World Trade Center. I said, nah, you gotta be kidding. It's gotta be a Piper Cub or some clown was flying down the river.
At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston, with 92 aboard, traveling at a speed of 470 miles per hour, strikes the North Tower of the World Trade Center complex. Within minutes, officials coordinate the citywide emergency response. Their base of operations is a state-of-the-art command center located on the 23rd floor of 7 World Trade Center. With one tower in flames, the tragedy is only beginning. It is 9:03 when United Airlines Flight 175, with 65 aboard, traveling at the speed of 590 miles per hour, smashes into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. This aircraft strikes the corner of the South Tower. It rips a diagonally shaped gash from the 84th to the 78th floors. The South Tower lasts only 56 minutes before it succumbs at 9:59 a.m. The dust cloud billows outward for blocks. Victims stagger away. At 10:28, the television mast atop the North Tower spears straight down.
Once the collapse started, there really wasn't any way to stop it. It was just going to go all the way down once it got started.
Chaos in New York City. Power is down in Lower Manhattan. Phone lines jammed with more than 230 million calls. Hundreds of firefighters trapped in the towers. Hundreds more race to the scene.
An absolutely devastating attack against the United States, and in many ways this answers the question about where the United States would go next now that the Cold War is over, that we would become a leader in the war against terror. So there's attacks on the World Trade Center. There's actually a plane that crashed into the Pentagon that same day, nearly 3,000 people dead in those attacks. And of course, this launches the war against terrorism and the war to try to find, or the effort to try to find, Osama bin Laden, who is in the lower left-hand corner of this screen here, who was the mastermind of those attacks. So, so Bush is, of course, president when this happens. I think it's the thing that most marks his presidency. Fairly famous image here of New York firefighters, New York police officers heading down to that scene to try to rescue as many people as they can from the debris from those 220-story high towers that collapse, as you saw here. So let's try this one. See if you can get the analogy that's being provided here. So of course you see the symbolism, the two towers in the background there, much like what we saw in the video clip just a second ago. But down in the lower right-hand part of the screen, we have these images of naval ships that are also burning and collapsing here. So the connection that this cartoonist is making, of course, is to Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941, the day that President Roosevelt famously said would live in infamy, this attack against the United States that absolutely changed everything for America. We became involved in the war against Japan and against the Nazis. And so the cartoonist here is trying to draw a connection here between those two events, another day that would live in infamy, September 11th of 2001. So one of the reactions by the federal government to that attack was this thing called the Patriot Act, which gave government surveillance powers to find terrorists. And you'll see some of the examples of the things here. Sneak and peek search warrants, which let authorities search a home or business without immediately notifying people, being able to wiretap things much more easily, expanding the scope of wiretaps. So this is a good example of, in situations of wartime, the federal government oftentimes or sometimes will limit people's civil liberties. So here's another question for Twitter for you. And Andrea of American Girl 26 actually gave the reason why President Johnson was impeached. So great job on that last question. So our Twitter question on this is, can you think of another example of a wartime abridgment of civil liberties, or another example where civil liberties were limited by the government during a war? There's a couple correct answers for that one. So we'll see what you come up with on Twitter for that one. So the point of view of the cartoon here, of course, is the person that you see here is mourning the Constitution, and this is expressing some concern about the loss of civil liberties as a result of the Patriot Act, and that's really what this cartoon is all about. I didn't want to give you two things to think about at the same time, so hopefully you have some answers to that first question that I have there. Okay, so Afghanistan eventually was invaded by the United States in an effort to try to find Osama bin Laden. And that happens in 2001. In 2003, Iraq was invaded in connection with September 11th, which the president tried to connect Osama bin Laden to Saddam Hussein, although there was some question about if there is any tie between those two things. And the war dragged on, as it typically, as unfortunately this did. And the longer the war dragged on, much like Vietnam, the more questions that were raised about what was happening in that war. Were we winning the war? Were we getting anywhere? And where the heck is this bin Laden guy? Another one of the unfortunate tragedies of that war is the exposure of mistreatment of prisoners that was taking place in some places by American servicemen and members of the CIA. And these are just some of the images that appeared on the news of terror suspects being mistreated, waterboarded in the lower left-hand corner here, for example. This guy being forced to stand on a box, and it's a little tough to see in the image here, but there's actually wires running to the person's fingers that you could administer a shock if their arms fell too far down on the side. So a lot of people responding to my earlier question about World War II. Great job. Hopefully you're thinking of things like the relocation centers for Japanese Americans. So here's a political cartoon. What is the point of view of this cartoon? So of course, you see here, this is President George W. Bush. He has the big ears there. Of course, cartoonists love to do that exaggeration a bit here, but it's the president telling us that this government is not torturing people. And hopefully you see in the background that shadow, of course, is a reflection of this image that I was just talking about just a moment ago here. So there's a clear connection to the symbolism of that. And the point of view, of course, is that maybe the government is not necessarily telling us the truth about what's going on in those places. So President Obama gets elected in 2008, our first African-American president. He runs against, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner here, John McCain and Sarah Palin. She's the first female vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party. You might remember I talked about Geraldine Ferraro a couple days ago, who was the first Democratic woman to make it onto the ticket as the vice presidential candidate. So Barack Obama inherits these wars that we were just talking about, and he promises to draw down the war and actually remove some troops from Iraq. But then later in his presidency, he decides to increase the troops in Afghanistan to try to increase security for them. And then late in his presidency, there seemed to be an increasing reliance on drone strikes, which are unmanned aircraft, which puts less American servicemen at risk as a result of that. And he also, during that period, there's a series of popular uprisings in the Middle East. The U.S. decided to aid the rebels in Libya there. So again, America sort of finding a new role for itself here in the world. And Obama approved the raid that ultimately ended up leading to the killing of Osama bin Laden. It was nicknamed Operation Geronimo. And the image that you see here, the large image, is President Obama. You can see him sitting here at the time, then Vice President Joe Biden sitting there, Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, and they're watching the raid unfold in the Situation Room. And it's a great photograph of that. During that administration. So kind of watching, you can just look at the looks on their faces, how they're intently staring at the screen to see what's happening there. So let's try again. What's the point of view of this cartoon? What's labeled? What's exaggerated? Of course, we see Obama here, and the exaggeration is his ears as well. Seems like cartoonist really honed in on that. But the cartoon, what's the cartoonist trying to say to us here? That it seemed like by drawing down troops, he was criticized. By putting more troops in, he was criticized. That no matter what it was that he was doing in the war in Afghanistan, that he was going to be criticized for that. So quick shout out to Forsetti Holsetti, Alan Zhang, Liliana Arias, Caleb Cody, Tallow Book, Andrea, Seth, Joby, Rhiannon, Diamond, Felicia Zhang, Deacon Tucker, Xu Xi, or Zhu, I believe, Jenny Marianne, and Hershey Banga for coming up with a correct answer for that civil liberties question that I asked a little bit ago. With President Obama with domestic affairs, a couple things that happened here. There's a bailout of the financial industry, which was which had started under President Bush, and also a bailout of General Motors, trying to help out that. But the most famous thing that Obama was known for is known as the Affordable Care Act, or sometimes known as Obamacare, which extended health benefits to 30 million Americans. So this is, in many ways, if you think back and make a little connection here, Bill Clinton tried to do this, and Obama ultimately was able to get that passed. So we'll try it again. What's the point of view of this cartoon? So hopefully you recognize this looks like a pill bottle here right in the middle of the screen. And a side effect is typically a negative effect that's connected with taking of a drug. So in this case, you have many of the side effects or the criticisms that people had of Obamacare, that this is what would happen, that this was socialism, the government getting too involved in our social lives or in the economy, that it would cost a lot of money, that it would pay for abortions, just as a couple examples of the things that are pointed out here in this cartoon. So gonna kind of move through this a little bit more quickly here. So a couple other quick trends just to mention. There's two of them. One is immigration, and one of the things that happens in the last unit of American history here really is a change in the trend of immigration. So if you take a look at the chart that's here, we have different years, 1960, 1970, 1980, etc. What's the change that's happening here in this cartoon with immigrants? And hopefully you notice that green, which is Europe, which is 75% of the immigrants in 1960, is down around 10% of the immigrants in 2003. And what's the group that grows the most here? The Americas. We're talking about Latin America, the rest of the hemisphere, the Western hemisphere. The other group that grows quite a bit is Asia in the purple lines that you see there. So lots more people coming from the Americas and from Asia, really after 1965, when the immigration laws were changed as a result of to get rid of some of the things that were put in place in the 1920s to try to limit immigration here. So we see a different group of people immigrating into the United States, and we've seen this trend before. There also is an increased cultural influence in the Sun Belt or the American South and the West because people continue to shift there. So not only immigrants coming in, especially from Mexico and Latin America into the southern parts of the United States, but there's also a shift, and I'll show you a map of that in just a second, of people leaving the Rust Belt, where I live in the upper Northeast here, into that region as well. So there's population moving around here. And debates over immigration continue in our own time. Even the 2016 election, there was part of that. And here's the map I was telling you about. People leaving, and you can see that my state, New York there, the purple one, is one of the ones that lost the most people. And you can see where people were going out to the south and out to the West Coast. 30% gain is that dark green. So Florida and Arizona are the states that seem to gain the most people here. And those regions tend to be more conservative. So that's a part of the reason for the rise in the direction of us moving into a more conservative direction in our politics. So what's the point of view of this cartoon? And I'll just make a note that this is from 2006. This is not a current political cartoon. So I love the fact that this cartoon is from 2006. It really shows that this is an issue that didn't just start yesterday, that this is something we've been talking about. And of course, the point of view, you have a construction worker here who's asking Uncle Sam, where am I going to be able to find people that will work cheaply to build this border wall? And of course, they're pointing out the irony of using cheap labor, especially from countries that might ultimately be negatively affected by the building of a border wall. And the last thing for today, and really we've done practice throughout, so we don't need to do the practices at the end here, but environmental concerns and environmentalism as an issue continues. And I talked about this a little bit with Nixon's presidency, the beginning of things like the EPA, that continues to be a debate. So let's do this last one here. So what's the point of view of this cartoon from 2015? So this is a Tom Towles cartoon. He's pointing out that fossil fuels, the guy on the left there is toasting. He's celebrating that climate change action has been delayed for 30 years in 2015. And the person on the right, you might notice he has some ice sculpting tools there in his apron, and he's offering to put an ice cube that he's referring to as what's left of Greenland, of course. So Tom Towles here, of course, is criticizing. Towles actually began his career at the Buffalo News, the local newspaper here, and now works for the Washington Post, a newspaper that you've probably heard of before. And with Tom Towles cartoons, you always have to look at the bottom because that's supposed to be the cartoonist there. And of course, he's making an additional little remark there. If it helps get rid of the evidence, then we'll toast that. Of course, putting the rest of Greenland, the last little chunk of ice that might be left if climate change continues, is the point of view of this cartoon. So as I said, we're going to skip over the practice here because we're running a little short on time, which is just great. Thank you again for watching. We hope that you'll tune in again tomorrow. Tomorrow we wrap up with Unit 9. And again, we'll begin reviewing on Monday, and we'll review the answer to this next question starting tomorrow. And so the answer to that question is: explain the relative significance of the changes in America after 1980 on American identity. Which of the changes that took place were the most important is what this question is asking about American identity. So relative significance, which is most important, which is least important. So of all the things that we've talked about over the last week in period 9 here, which ones are the most important in changing who America sees itself as? Again, military leader, industrial leader, moral leader, which one? So think about that for tomorrow. Thanks once again for tuning in. Sorry we ran just a touch late here today, and hopefully we'll see you again real soon. Signing off. See you soon.